2. History of European Nihilism. 57. 1884. My friends, it was hard for us when we were young. We suffered youth itself like a serious sickness. That is due to the time into which we have been thrown, a time of extensive inner decay and disintegration, a time that with all its weakness, even with its best strength, opposes the spirit of youth. Disintegration characterizes this time, and thus uncertainty. Nothing stands firmly on its feet or on a hard faith in itself. One lives for tomorrow, as the day after tomorrow is dubious. Everything on our way is slippery and dangerous, and the ice that still supports us has become thin. All of us feel the warm, uncanny breath of the thawing wind. Where we still walk, soon no one will be able to walk. 58. 1885 to 1888. If this is not an age of decay and declining vitality, it is at least one of headlong and arbitrary experimentation. And it is probable that a superabundance of bungled experiments should create an overall impression as of decay, and perhaps even decay itself. 59. 1885 to 1886. Toward a history of the modern eclipse. The state nomads, civil servants, etc., without home. The decline of the family. The good man as a symptom of exhaustion. Justice as will to power, breeding. Lasciviousness and neurosis. Black music. Whither refreshing music? The anarchist. Contempt for man, nausea. Deepest difference, whether hunger or overabundance becomes creative. The former generates the ideals of romanticism, Nordica naturalness, the need for alcoholica, the distress of the workers, philosophical nihilism. 60. 1885. The slow emergence and rise of the middle and lower classes, including the lower kind of spirit and body, of which one finds many preludes before the French Revolution, and it would have taken place without the Revolution, two on the whole, then the predominance of the herd over all shepherds and bellwethers, involves 1. Eclipse of the spirit, the fusion of a stoic and frivolous appearance of happiness, characteristic of noble cultures, decreases. One lets much suffering be seen and heard that one formerly bore and hid. 2. Moral hypocrisy, a way of wishing to distinguish oneself not by means of morality, but by means of the herd virtues. Pity, consideration, moderation, which are not recognized and honored outside the herd ability. 3. A really great amount of shared suffering, pity, and joy, the pleasure in large-scale associations found in all herd animals. Community spirit, fatherland, everything in which the individual does not count. 61. Summer-fall, 1883. Our time, with its aspiration to remedy and prevent accidental distresses and to wage preventative war against disagreeable possibilities, is a time of the poor. Our rich are poorest of all. The true purpose of all riches is forgotten. 62. Spring-fall, 1887. Critique of modern man, his moralistic mendaciousness. The good man, corrupted and seduced by bad institutions, tyrants and priests. Reason as authority. History as overcoming of errors. The future as progress. The Christian state, the Lord of hosts. The Christian sex impulse, or marriage. The kingdom of justice. The cult of humanity. Freedom. The romantic pose of modern man, the noble man, Byron, Victor Hugo, George Sand. Noble indignation, consecration through passion, as true nature. Siding with the oppressed and underprivileged, motto of the historians and novelists. The Stoics of duty, selflessness as art and knowledge. Altruism as the most mendacious form of egoism, utilitarianism, most sentimental egoism. All this is 18th century. What, on the other hand, has not been inherited from it? Insouciance, cheerfulness, elegance, brightness of the spirit. The tempo of the spirit has changed. The enjoyment of refinement and clarity of the spirit has given place to the enjoyment of color, harmony, mass, reality, etc. Sensualism in matters of the spirit. In short, it is the 18th century of Rousseau. 63. January to fall, 1888. On the whole, a tremendous quantum of humaneness has been attained in present-day mankind. That this is not felt generally is itself a proof. We have become so sensitive concerning small states of distress that we unjustly ignore what has been attained. Here one must make allowance for the existence of much decadence, and seen with such eyes our world has to look wretched and miserable. But such eyes have at all times seen the same things. 1. A certain over-irritation even of the moral feelings. 2. The quantum of embitterment and eclipse that pessimism carries into judgments. These two together account for the predominance of the opposite notion that our morality is in a bad way. The fact of credit, of worldwide trade, of the means of transportation, here a tremendous mild trust in man finds expression. Another contributing factor is 3. The emancipation of science for moral and religious purposes. A very good sign that, however, is usually misunderstood. In my own way, I attempt a justification of history. 64. Spring to fall, 1887. The second Buddhism, the nihilistic catastrophe that finishes Indian culture. Early signs of it. The immense increase of pity. Spiritual weariness. The reduction of problems to questions of pleasure and displeasure. The war glory that provokes a counterstroke. Just as national demarcation provokes a counter-movement, the most cordial fraternity. The impossibility for religion to go on working with dogmas and fables. 65. November 1887 to March 1888. What is attacked deep down today is the instinct and the will of tradition. All institutions that owe their origins to this instinct violate the taste of the modern spirit. At bottom, nothing is thought and done without the purpose of eradicating this sense for tradition. One considers tradition a fatality. One studies it, recognizes it as heredity, but one does not want it. The tensing of a will over long temporal distances, the selection of the states and valuations that allow one to dispose of future centuries. Precisely this is anti-modern in the highest degree, which goes to show that it is the disorganizing principle that give our age its character. 66. Spring to fall, 1887. Be simple. For us complicated and elusive triers of the reins a demand that is a simple stupidity. Be natural. But how if one happens to be unnatural? 67. 1884. The former means for obtaining homogeneous, enduring characters for long generations. Unalienable landed property, honoring the old, origin of the belief in gods and heroes as ancestors. Now the breaking up of landed property belongs to the opposite tendency. Newspapers, in place of daily prayers. Railway, telegraph. Centralization of a tremendous number of different interests in a single soul, which for that reason must be very strong and protean. 68. March to June, 1888. Why everything turns into histrionics. Modern man lacks the sure instinct, consequence of a long homogeneous form of activity of one kind of man. The inability to achieve anything perfect is merely a consequence of this. As an individual, one can never make up for lost schooling. That which creates a morality, a code of laws, the profound instinct that only automatism makes possible perfection in life and creation. But now we have reached the opposite point. Indeed, we wanted to reach it. The most extreme consciousness, man's ability to see through himself and history. With this we are practically as far as possible from perfection in being, doing, and willing. Our desire, even our will for knowledge, is a symptom of a tremendous decadence. We strive for the opposite of that which strong races, strong natures want. Understanding is an ending. That science is possible in the sense that is cultivated today is proof that all elementary instincts, Life's instincts of self-defense and protection no longer function. We no longer collect. We squander the capital of our ancestors, even in the way in which we seek knowledge. 69, 1885 to 1886. Nihilistic traits. 1. In the natural sciences, meaninglessness, causalism, mechanism, lawfulness, and inter acte, a residue. 2. Ditto in politics. One lacks the faith in one's right, innocence. Mendaciousness rules in serving the moment. 3. Ditto in economics. The abolition of slavery. The lack of a redeeming class, one that justifies. Advent of anarchism. Education. 4. Ditto in history. Fatalism. Darwinism. The final attempts to read reason and divinity into it all fails. Sentimentality in face of the past. One could not endure a biography. Here, too, phenomenalism, character as a mask. There are no facts. 5. Ditto in art. Romanticism and its counterstroke, aversion against romantic ideals and lies. The latter, moral as a sense of greater truthfulness, but pessimistic. Pure artists, indifferent toward content. Father Confessor psychology and Puritan psychology, two forms of the psychological romanticism, but even its counter-proposal, the attempt to adopt a purely artistic attitude toward man, even there the opposite valuation is not yet ventured. 70. 1885 to 1886. Against the doctrine of the influence of the milieu and external causes, the force within is infinitely superior. Much that looks like external influence is merely its adaptation from within. The very same milieus can be interpreted and exploited in opposite ways. There are no facts. A genius is not explained in terms of such conditions of his origin. 71. Spring to Fall, 1887. Revised Spring to Fall, 1888. Modernity in the perspective of the metaphor of nourishment and digestion. Sensibility immensely more irritable. Dressed up moralistically. The increase in pity. The abundance of disparate impressions greater than ever. Cosmopolitanism in foods, literatures, newspapers, forms, tastes, even landscapes. The tempo of this influx prestissimo. The impressions erase each other. One instinctively resists taking in anything deeply, to digest anything. A weakening of the power to digest results from this. A kind of adaptation to this flood of impressions takes place. Men unlearn spontaneous action. They merely react to stimuli from outside. They spend their strength partly in assimilating things, partly in defense, partly in opposition. Profound weakening of spontaneity. The historian, critic, analyst, the interpreter, the observer, the collector, the reader, all of them reactive talents, all science. Artificial change of one's nature into a mirror, interested but, as it were, merely epidermically interested. A coolness on principle, a balance, a fixed low temperature closely underneath the thin surface on which warmth, movement, tempest, and the play of waves are encountered. Opposition of external mobility and a certain deep heaviness and weariness. 72. January to Fall, 1888. Where does our modern world belong? To exhaustion or ascent? Its manifoldness and unrest conditioned by the attainment of the highest level of consciousness. 73. Spring to Fall, 1887. Overwork, curiosity, and sympathy, our modern vices. 74. Spring to Fall, 1887. Toward a characterization of modernity, overabundant development of intermediary forms, atrophy of types, traditions break off, schools, the overlordship of the instincts, prepared philosophically, the unconscious worth more. After the willpower, the willing of end and means has been weakened. 75. 1885. An able craftsman or scholar cuts a fine figure when he takes pride in his art and looks on life content and satisfied. But nothing looks more wretched than when a shoemaker or schoolmaster gives us to understand with the suffering mean that he was really born for something better. There is nothing better than what is good, and good is having some ability and using that to create. Tuch decay or virtue in the Italian Renaissance sense. Today, in our time, when the state has an absurdly fat stomach, there are in all fields and departments, in addition to the real workers, also representatives, e.g., besides the scholars, also scribblers, besides the suffering classes, also garrulous, boastful Peter do-wells who represent the suffering, not to speak of the professional politicians who are well off while representing distress with powerful lungs before a parliament. Our modern life is extremely expensive owing to the large number of intermediaries. In an ancient city, on the other hand, and, echoing that, also in many cities in Spain and Italy, one appeared oneself and would have given a hoot to such modern representatives and intermediaries, or a kick. 76, spring to fall, 1887. The predominance of dealers and intermediaries in spiritual matters. 2. The scribbler, the representative, the historian, who fuses past and present, the exegetian and cosmopolitan, the intermediaries between science and philosophy, the semi-theologians. 77, 1883 to 1888. Nothing to date has nauseated me more than the parasites of the spirit. In our unhealthy Europe one already finds them everywhere, and they have the best conscience in the world, perhaps a little dim, a little air pessimiste, but in the main voracious, dirty, dirtying, creeping in, nestling, thievish, scurvy, and as innocent as all little sinners and microbes. They live off the fact that other people have spirit and squander it. They know that it is of the very essence of the rich spirit to squander itself carelessly, without petty caution, from day to day. For the spirit is a bad householder and pays no heed to how everybody lives and feeds on it. 78, 1885 to 1886. Histrionics. The colorfulness of modern man and its charm, essentially concealment and satiety. The scribbler, the politician, and the nationalist swindle. Histrionics in the arts. Lack of probity in prior training and schooling. Fromentin. The romantics. Lack of philosophy and science and superabundance of literature. The novelists. Walter Scott, but also the Nibelungian monsters along with the most nervous music. The lyric poets. Being scientific. Virtuous. Jews. Popular ideals overcome, but not yet in the eyes of the people. The saint, the sage, the prophet. 79, spring to fall, 1887. The modern spirit's lack of discipline, dressed up in all sorts of moral fashions. The showy words are tolerance, for the incapacity for yes and no. A largeur de sympathie, 1/3 indifference, 1/3 curiosity, 1/3 pathological irritability. Objectivity, lack of personality, lack of will, incapacity for love. Freedom versus rules, romanticism. Truth versus forgery and lies, naturalism. Being scientific, the document hernane. In other words, the novel of colportage and addition in place of composition. Passion meaning disorder and immoderation. Depth meaning confusion, the profuse chaos of symbols. 80. November 1887 to March 1888. Toward a critique of the big words, I am full of suspicion and malice against what they call ideals. This is my pessimism, to have recognized how the higher feelings are a source of misfortune and man's loss of value. One is deceived every time one expects progress from an ideal. Every time so far the victory of the ideal has met a retrograde movement. Christianity, the revolution, the abolition of slavery, equal rights, philanthropy, love of peace, justice, truth, all these big words have value only in a fight, as flags, not as realities, but as showy words for something quite different, indeed opposite. 81, 1883 to 1888. One knows the kind of human being who has fallen in love with the motto, Taut comprende si est taut pardonor. It is the weak, it is above all the disappointed. If there is something to be forgiven in all, perhaps there is also something to be despised in all. It is the philosophy of disappointment that wraps itself so humanely in pity and looks so sweet. These are romantics whose faith flew the coop. Now they at least want to watch how everything passes and goes. They call it art pour l'art, objectivity, etc. 82, spring to fall, 1887. Chief symptoms of pessimism: the diner's ches magway, Russian pessimism, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. Aesthetic pessimism, art pour l'art. Description, romantic and anti-romantic pessimism. Epistemological pessimism, Schopenhauer, phenomenalism. Anarchistic pessimism, the religion of pity. Buddhistic pre-movement. Cultural pessimism, exoticism, cosmopolitanism. Moralistic pessimism, I myself. 83. Spring to fall, 1887. Without the Christian faith, Pascal thought, you, no less than nature and history, will become for yourselves un monstre et un chaos. And this prophecy we have fulfilled, after the feeble optimistic 18th century had prettified and rationalized man. Schopenhauer and Pascal. In an important sense, Schopenhauer is the first to take up again the movement of Pascal, un monstre et un chaos, consequently something to be negated. History, nature, man himself. Our inability to know the truth is the consequence of our corruption, our moral decay. Thus Pascal, and thus, at bottom, Schopenhauer. The deeper the corruption of reason, the more necessary the doctrine of salvation, or, in Schopenhauer's terms, negation. 84, spring to fall, 1887. Schopenhauer's throwback, state before the revolution. Pity, sensuality, art, weakness of the will, Catholicism of spiritual cravings, that is good 18th century à fond. Schopenhauer's basic misunderstanding of the will, as if craving, instinct, drive were the essence of will, is typical, lowering the value of the will to the point of making a real mistake. Also hatred against willing, attempt to see something higher, indeed that which is higher and valuable, in willing no more, in being a subject without aim and purpose, in the pure subject of free will. Great symptom of the exhaustion or the weakness of the will, for the will is precisely that which treats cravings as their master and appoints to them their way and measure. 85, January to fall, 1888. The unworthy attempt has been made to see Wagner and Schopenhauer as types of mental illness. One would gain an incomparably more essential insight by making more precise scientifically the type of decadence both represent. 86, 1888. Your Henrik Ibsen has become very clear to me. For all his robust idealism and will to truth, he did not dare to liberate himself from the illusionism of morality that speaks of freedom without wishing to admit to itself what freedom is. The second stage in the metamorphosis of the will to power for those who lack freedom. On the first stage, one demands justice from those who are in power. On the second, one speaks of freedom, that is, one wants to get away from those in power. On the third, one speaks of equal rights, that is, as long as one has not yet gained superiority, one wants to prevent one's competitors from growing in power. 87, spring to fall, 1887. Decline of Protestantism, understood as a halfway house both theoretically and historically. Actual superiority of Catholicism. The feeling of Protestantism extinguished to such an extent that the strongest anti-Protestant movements are no longer experienced as such. For example, Wagner's Parsifal. All of the higher regions of the spirit in France are Catholic in their instincts. Bismarck realizes that Protestantism simply doesn't exist anymore. 88, spring to fall, 1887. Protestantism, that spiritually unclean and boring form of decadence in which Christianity has been able so far to preserve itself in the mediocre North. Valuable for knowledge as something complex in a halfway house, insofar as it brought together in the same heads experiences of different orders and origins. 89, March to June, 1888. How did the German spirit transform Christianity? And to stick to Protestantism, how much beer there is in Protestant Christianity. Can one even imagine a spiritually staler, lazier, more comfortably relaxed form of the Christian faith than that of the average Protestant in Germany? That's what I call a modest version of Christianity. A homeopathy of Christianity is what I call it. One reminds me that today we also encounter an immodest Protestantism, that of the court chaplains and anti-Semitic speculators. But nobody has claimed yet that any spirit would ever moved on the faces of these waters. That is merely a more indecent form of Christianity, by no means more sensible. 90. January to fall, 1888. Progress. Let us not be deceived. Time marches forward. We'd like to believe that everything that is in it also marches forward, that the development is one that moves forward. The most level-headed are led astray by this illusion. But the 19th century does not represent progress over the 16th, and the German spirit of 1888 represents a regress from the German spirit of 1788. Mankind does not advance. It does not even exist. The overall aspect is that of a tremendous experimental laboratory in which a few successes are scored, scattered throughout all ages, while there are untold failures, and all order, logic, union, and obligingness are lacking. How can we fail to recognize that the ascent of Christianity is a movement of decadence, that the German Reformation is a recrudescence of Christian barbarism, that the Revolution destroyed the instinct for a grand organization of society? Man represents no progress over the animal. The civilized tenderfoot is an abortion compared to the Arab and Corsican. The Chinese is a more successful type, namely more durable, than the European. 91, 1888. On German pessimism. The eclipse, the pessimistic coloring, comes necessarily in the wake of the Enlightenment. Around 1770, the decline of the cheerfulness began to be noticed. Women, with that feminine instinct which always sides with virtue, supposed that immorality was the cause. Galliani hit the nail on the head. He cites Voltaire's verse, "Un monstre gai vat mieux, qu'un sentimental ennuyeux." When I believe now that I am a few centuries ahead in enlightenment, not only of Voltaire, but even of Galliani, who was far profounder, how far must I have got in the increase of darkness? And this is really the case, and I bewared in time, with some sort of regret, of the German and Christian narrowness and inconsequence of pessimism a la Schopenhauer, or worse, Lepardi, and sought out the most quintessential forms, Asia. But in order to endure this type of extreme pessimism, it can be perceived here and there in my birth of tragedy, and to live alone, without God and morality, I had to invent a counterpart for myself. Perhaps I know best why man alone laughs. He alone suffers so deeply that he had to invent laughter. The unhappiest and most melancholy animal is, as fitting, the most cheerful. 92, 1883 to 1888. Regarding German culture, I've always had the feeling of decline. This fact, that I first became acquainted with a type in decline, has often made me unfair to the whole phenomenon of European culture. The Germans always come after the others. Much later, they are carrying something in the depths, e.g., dependence on other countries, e.g., Kant, Rousseau, Centralists, Hume, Swedenborg. Schopenhauer, Indians and Romanticism, Voltaire. Wagner, French cult of the gruesome and of grand opera, Paris and the flight into primeval states, marriage with a sister. The laws of the latecomers, province to Paris, Germany to France. Why the Germans of all people discovered the Greek spirit. The more one develops a drive, the more attractive does it become to plunge for once into its opposite. Music is swan song. 93. January to fall, 1888. Renaissance and Reformation. What does the Renaissance prove? That the reign of the individual has to be brief. The squandering is too great. The very possibility of collecting and capitalizing is lacking, and exhaustion follows immediately. These are times when everything is spent, when the very strength is spent with which one collects, capitalizes, and piles riches upon riches. Even the opponents of such movements are forced into an absurd waste of energy. They, too, soon become exhausted, spent, desolate. In the Reformation we possess a wild and vulgar counterpart to the Italian Renaissance, born of related impulses, only into the retarded North, which had remained coarse. They had to don a religious disguise, for there the concept of the higher life had not yet detached itself from that of the religious life. Through the Reformation, too, the individual sought freedom. Everybody his own priest is also a mere formula of libertinage. In truth, one word was enough: evangelical freedom, and all instincts that had reason to remain hidden broke out like wild dogs. The most brutal requirements suddenly acquired the courage to face themselves, and everything seemed justified. One was careful not to understand what liberty one had really meant at bottom. One shut one's eyes before oneself. But shutting one's eyes and moistening one's lips with enthusiastic orations did not prevent one's hands from grasping whatever could be grabbed, and the belly became the god of the free evangel, and all the cravings of revenge and envy satisfied themselves with insatiable rage. This took a while. Then exhaustion set in, just as it had in the south of Europe, and here, too, a vulgar kind of exhaustion, a general word of servidium. The indecent century of Germany arrived. 94, 1884. Chivalry is the conquered position of power, its gradual breaking up, and in part transition into what is more spread out, bourgeois. In La Rochefoucauld we find a consciousness of the true motive springs of noblesse of the mind, and a view of these motive springs that is darkened by Christianity. The French Revolution is the continuation of Christianity. Rousseau is the seducer. He again unfetters woman who is henceforth represented in an ever more interesting manner as suffering. Then the slaves and Mrs. Beecher Stowe. Then the poor and the workers. Then the vice addicts and the sick. All this is moved into the foreground. Even to develop sympathy for genius, one no longer knows any other way for the past 500 years than to represent him as the bearer of great suffering. Next come the curse on voluptuousness. Baudelaire and Schopenhauer. The most decided conviction that the lust to rule is the greatest vice. The perfect certainty that morality and disinterestedness are identical concepts and that the happiness of all is a goal worth striving for, i.e., the kingdom of heaven of Christ. We are well along on the way. The kingdom of heaven of the poor in spirit has begun. Intermediary stages. The bourgeois, a parvenu on account of money, and the worker on account of the machine. Comparison of Greek culture and that of the French in the age of Louis XIV. Decided faith in oneself. A leisure class whose members make things difficult for themselves and exercise much self-overcoming. The power of form, the will to give form to oneself. Happiness admitted as a goal. Much strength and energy behind the emphasis on forms. The delight in looking at the life that seems so easy. To the French, the Greeks looked like children. 95. Spring to fall, 1887. The three centuries. Their different sensibilities are best expressed thus. Aristocratism. Descartes, rule of reason, testimony of the sovereignty of the will. Feminism. Rousseau, rule of feeling, testimony of the sovereignty of the senses, mendacious. Animalism. Schopenhauer, rule of craving, testimony of the sovereignty of animality, more honest but gloomy. The 17th century is aristocratic, imposes order, looks down haughtily upon the animalistic, is severe against the heart, not cozy, without sentiment. German. Averse to what is burlesque and what is natural, inclined to generalizations, and sovereign confronted with the past, for it believes in itself. Much beast of prey off fond, much ascetic habit to remain master. The century of strong will, also of strong passion. The 18th century is dominated by woman, given to enthusiasm, full of esprit, shallow, but with the spirit in the service of what is desirable, of the heart, libertine in the enjoyment of what is most spiritual, and undermines all authorities, intoxicated, cheerful, clear, humane, false before itself, much canaille à fond, sociable. The 19th century is more animalic and subterranean, uglier, more realistic and vulgar, and precisely for that reason better, more honest, more submissive before every kind of reality, truer, but weak in will, but sad and full of dark cravings, but fatalistic, not full of awe and reverence for either reason or heart, deeply convinced of the rule of cravings. Schopenhauer spoke of will, but nothing is more characteristic of his philosophy than the absence of all genuine willing. Even morality reduced to one instinct, pity. Auguste Comte is a continuation of the 18th century, domination of corps over la tête, sensualism in the theory of knowledge, altruistic enthusiasm. That science has become sovereign to such a degree proves how the 19th century has rid itself of the domination of ideals. A certain frugality of desire makes possible our scientific curiosity, and severity which is our kind of virtue. Romanticism is an echo of the 18th century, a kind of piled-high desire for its enthusiasm in the grand style. As a matter of fact, a good deal of histrionics and self-deception. One wanted to represent strong natures and grand passions. The 19th century looks instinctively for theories that seem to justify its fatalistic submission to matters of fact. Already Hegel's success against sentimentality and romantic idealism was due to his fatalistic way of thinking, to his faith in the greater reason on the side of the victorious, to his justification of the actual state in place of mankind, etc. Schopenhauer. We are something stupid and, at best, even something that cancels itself. Success of determinism, of the genealogical derivation of obligations that had formerly been considered absolute. The doctrine of milieu and adaptation, the reduction of will to reflexes, the denial of the will as an efficient cause. Finally, a real rechristening. One sees so little will that the word becomes free to designate something else. Further theories, the doctrine of objectivity, will-less, contemplation, as the only road to truth, also to beauty, also the faith in the genius to justify a right to submission. Mechanism, the calculable rigidity of the mechanical process, the alleged naturalism, elimination of the choosing, judging, interpreting subject as a principle. Kant, with his practical reason and his moral fanaticism, is wholly 18th century, still entirely outside the historical movement, without any eye for the actuality of his time, e.g., revolution, untouched by Greek philosophy, fanciful visionary of the concept of duty, sensualist with the backdrop of the pampering of dogmatism. The movement back to Kant in our century is a movement back to the 18th century. One wants to regain a right to the old ideals and the old enthusiasm. For that reason, an epistemology that sets boundaries, which means that it permits one to posit as one may see fit a beyond of reason. Hegel's way of thinking is not far different from Goethe's. One needs only to listen to Goethe about Spinoza. Will to deify the universe and life in order to find repose and happiness in contemplation and in getting to the bottom of things. Hegel seeks reason everywhere before reason one may submit and acquiesce. And Goethe, a kind of almost joyous and trusting fatalism that does not revolt, that does not flag, that seeks to form a totality out of himself, in the faith that only in the totality everything redeems itself and appears good and justified. 96, spring to fall, 1887. Period of enlightenment, followed by the period of sentimentality. To what extent Schopenhauer belongs to sentimentality, Hegel to spirituality. 97, Spring to Fall, 1887. The 17th century suffers of man as of a sum of contradictions, the aims des contradictions, that we are. It seeks to discover, order, excavate man, while the 18th century seeks to forget what is known of man's nature in order to assimilate him to its utopia. Superficial, tender, humane, enthusiastic about man. The 17th century seeks to erase the tracks of the individual to make the work look as similar to life as possible. The 18th uses the work in an attempt to arouse interest in the author. The 17th century seeks in art, a piece of culture. The 18th uses art to make propaganda for reforms of a social and political nature. Utopia, the ideal man, the deification of nature, the vanity of posing, the subordination to propaganda for social goals, charlatanism. These are our gifts from the 18th century. The style of the 17th century, propre exactate libre. The strong individual, self-sufficient or zealously occupied before God, and this modern obtrusiveness of authors who all but leap out at you. These furnish some contrast. To perform, compare that with the scholars of Port Royal. Alfieri had a sense for grand style. Hatred of the burlesque, undignified, lack of a sense for nature belonged to the 17th century. 98, Spring to Fall, 1887. Against Rousseau, unfortunately, man is no longer evil enough. Rousseau's opponents who say man is a beast of prey are unfortunately wrong. Not the corruption of man, but the extent to which he has become tender and moralized is his curse. Precisely in the sphere that Rousseau fought most violently, one could find the relatively still strong and well-turned-out type of man, those in whom the grand affects were still unbroken, will to power, will to enjoyment, will and capacity to command. The man of the 18th century has to be compared with the man of the Renaissance, also with the man of the 17th century in France, so that one feels what is at stake. Rousseau is a symptom of self-contempt and heated vanity, both signs that the domineering will is lacking. He moralizes and, as a man of rancor, seeks the cause of his wretchedness in the ruling classes. 99, Spring to Fall, 1887. Against Rousseau. The state of nature is terrible. Man is a beast of prey. Our civilization represents a tremendous triumph over this beast of prey nature. Thus argued Voltaire. He felt the mitigation, the subtleties, the spiritual joys of the civilized state. He despised narrow-mindedness, also in the form of virtue, and the lack of delicatesse, also among ascetics and monks. The moral reprehensibility of a man seemed to preoccupy Rousseau. With the words unjust and cruel, one can best stir up the instincts of the oppressed, who otherwise smart under the ban of the vetitum and disfavor, so that their conscience advises them against rebellious cravings. Such emancipators seek one thing above all, to give their party the grand accents and poses of the higher nature. 100, Spring to Fall, 1887. Rousseau, the rule based on feeling, nature as the source of justice. Man perfects himself to the extent to which he approaches nature, according to Voltaire, the extent to which he moves away from nature. The very same epochs are for one ages of the progress of humanity, for the other, times when injustice and inequality grow worse. Voltaire still comprehended humanity in the Renaissance sense, also virtue as high culture. He fights for the cause of the honnêtes gens and de la bonne compagnie, the cause of taste, of science, of the arts, of progress itself and civilization. The fight began around 1760. The citizen of Geneva and Le Seigneur de Ferney. Only from that moment on, Voltaire becomes the man of his century, the philosopher, the representative of tolerance and unbelief, till then merely un bel esprit. Envy and hatred of Rousseau's success impelled him forward to the heights. Pour la canaille, un doit ruminateur en vaincre, Voltaire. Critique of both points of view in regard to the value of civilization. The social invention is for Voltaire the most beautiful there is. There is no higher goal than to maintain and perfect it. Precisely this is honnêteté. To respect social conventions. Virtue is obedience to certain necessary prejudices in favor of the preservation of society. Missionary of culture, aristocrat, representative of the victorious, ruling classes and their valuations. But Rousseau remained a plebeian, also as homme des lettres. That was unheard of. His impudent contempt of all that was not he himself. What was sick in Rousseau was admired and imitated most. Lord Byron related to him, also worked himself up into sublime poses and into vindictive rancor, signs of meanness, later attained balance through Venice, and comprehended what produces more ease and well-being, insouciance. Rousseau is proud in regard to what he is, in spite of his origins, but he is beside himself when one reminds him of it. Rousseau, beyond a doubt, mentally disturbed. In Voltaire, an uncommon health and light touch. The rancor of the sick. The periods of his insanity, also those of his contempt of man and his mistrust. The defense of Providence by Rousseau against the pessimism of Voltaire. He needed God in order to be able to cast a curse upon society and civilization. Everything had to be good in itself because God had created it. Only man has corrupted men. The good man, as the natural man, was pure fantasy, but with the dogma of God's authorship it seemed probable and well-founded. Romanticism a la Rousseau. Passion, the sovereign right of passion. Naturalness, the fascination of madness. Folly included in greatness, the absurd vanity of the weak man, the rancor of the mob as judge. For 100 years now, a sick man has been accepted as a leader in politics.